In the past few days, NATO has been facing an unprecedented crisis after the US, a founding member of NATO and its biggest military contributor, refused to rule out using military force to annex Greenland, a semi-autonomous territory in the Arctic belonging to fellow NATO member Denmark. On Tuesday, the White House said it was exploring a range of possibilities for acquiring Greenland, saying using the military is, quote, always an option. Not only would militarily seizing Greenland violate both the UN and NATO charters, but it would also wreck NATO, with Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen saying a US attack on Greenland wouldn't just end NATO, but would end, quote, everything. If that wasn't bad enough, on Wednesday, Trump then scoffed at NATO in a Truth Social post, saying, "I doubt NATO would be there for us if we really needed them," despite the fact that the only time NATO's mutual defence clause has ever been invoked was after 9/11. So, in this video, we'll explain NATO's existential crisis, and whether this could actually be the end of the alliance. If you love staying informed and want some of the best reporting on YouTube, then subscribe and ring the bell for more. Let's start with a bit of NATO history. In 1949, after World War II, the North Atlantic Treaty, also known as the Washington Treaty, was signed by 12 North American and European countries, highlighted on screen now, establishing a collective security alliance, whereby member states agreed to mutually defend each other in response to an attack by a non-NATO country. Throughout the Cold War, NATO was primarily concerned with the threat posed by the Soviet Union, and over time has expanded to 32 members, with Finland and Sweden joining most recently in 2023 and 2024, in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Anyway, the cornerstone of NATO is its Article 5 Mutual Defence Clause, which states that an armed attack against one or more NATO members shall be considered an attack against them all, and that, if such an attack occurs, each of them will assist the party or parties so attacked. In practice, this assistance may or may not involve the use of armed force, but NATO members have generally understood this to mean that an attack on one ally would ultimately trigger a collective military response. However, in recent months, two things, Russia's escalating hybrid war and a further souring of the US-EU relationship, have cast doubt over the NATO alliance. This week, just hours after bombing Venezuela and abducting its president, Trump said the US needed Greenland very badly, prompting some commentators to begin openly discussing the potential collapse of NATO. Even Denmark's Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen told the Danish TV station TV2 if the United States decides to militarily attack another NATO country, then everything would stop. That includes NATO and therefore post-Second World War security. So, could we actually be witnessing the end of NATO? Well, while there have been warnings about a potential NATO collapse before, for example in 1966 when French President Charles de Gaulle withdrew France from NATO's integrated military command, or in 2003 when NATO was internally divided over the US invasion of Iraq, there are at least two existential threats to the alliance right now. The first is the US's military threats towards Greenland. In December 2024, after his re-election, Trump suggested using military force to annex Greenland, Canada and Panama, having suggested buying Greenland during his first term. At the time, these were considered outrageous but unserious ideas, especially given Canada and Greenland's NATO membership, and the fact that invading another country would obviously breach international law. However, the US's strike in the Caribbean, attack on Venezuela, which Trump authorized without informing Congress, and abduction of Maduro, in an operation that reportedly killed 80 people, have shown Trump is willing to violate international law to achieve his foreign policy aims. In a press conference hours after the Venezuela operation, Trump said, "We do need Greenland, absolutely," and US Secretary of State Marco Rubio said, "When Trump tells you he's going to do something, he means it." This sparked major concern in Europe, and on Tuesday, Denmark, France, Germany, Italy, Poland, the UK and Spain published a joint statement reminding the US of its obligations in NATO and concluding it is for Denmark and Greenland, and them only, to decide on matters concerning Denmark and Greenland. In NATO's 76-year history, no member has ever attacked another, so a US attack on Greenland would immediately undermine NATO's founding charter. The second threat to NATO is growing ambiguity over Article 5. NATO's founding treaty was written towards the start of the Cold War, when NATO's European members were worried about the prospect of Soviet tanks rolling across the continent. Article 5 was not, however, designed for the current era of hybrid and grey zone warfare, and Russia has already put real strain on Article 5 by staging acts of sabotage and cyber attacks that often fall below the threshold of an armed attack. However, yet more strain has been put on Article 5 by Trump recently. Trump has suggested multiple times in the past that, under his leadership, the US might not respond to the triggering of Article 5 by one of NATO's European members. On his way to the annual NATO summit last year, for instance, Trump was asked whether he still supported Article 5, to which he responded, "Depends on your definition." Trump did later walk this back, insisting at the summit he was still committed to Article 5, but more recent comments have, once again, cast doubt on the idea. This week, for instance, Trump questioned on Truth Social whether NATO's European members wouldn't actually help the US if it triggered Article 5, with the implication being that the US, therefore, shouldn't help them. Furthermore, Trump's national security strategy, published in November 2025, states the US's strategic priority is to, quote, restore American preeminence in the Western Hemisphere, and it's since been very clear that Trump is mainly focused on dominating the Americas, which he sees as the US's sphere of influence. This is great for Putin, who also sees the world in terms of spheres of influence, but pretty terrible for European NATO members, because it implies Trump is unlikely to actually respond to a triggering of Article 5, given his strategic indifference towards Europe. This would be disastrous for NATO's European members, given the alliance's logistical dependence on the US. NATO is enormously reliant on the US's operational capabilities, including logistics, command and control, and intelligence capabilities. And while the alliance's internal structures are designed to be flexible, it would take Europe years or even decades to replace the US's role in NATO. As such, the US withdrawing from Europe militarily would leave NATO lacking in key domains. So, what next? Well, for NATO's European members, there are two urgent challenges. Firstly, dealing with the immediate threat towards Greenland, and secondly, securing the alliance's future. On the first question, NATO's European allies are holding emergency talks, with the French, German and Polish foreign ministers having met on Wednesday to coordinate a potential response. On NATO's future, it's probably a good idea for NATO's European members to do what they can to reduce their reliance on the US, but ultimately, whether the alliance survives will depend mostly on America. If you're interested in this, in the latest issue of our magazine, we discuss every major election that happened in 2025, running through races in Poland, Australia, Canada, Singapore, Germany, Japan, Norway, South Korea, the Netherlands, Argentina, Bolivia, Cameroon, Czechia and Jamaica, helping you to catch up on stories you might have missed, as well as understanding the trends taking place around the world. There's so much more in this issue too. In addition to our cover story about the new Middle East, there's also full sections dedicated to UK, EU and global news. The EU section includes our interview with fellow creator Money and Macro, where we discuss how to fix the European economy, Macron's fall from grace, and how Albania has implemented an AI minister. The global section discusses why Trump's mandate isn't quite what it seems, how politicians conquered social media, plus our election summary I just mentioned. And our UK section runs through the rise of the new left, why this year's elections are critical at all levels, as well as the strategies Starmer ought to take to maintain power, and Farage to gain power. Subscribers to Too Long automatically get 20% off every copy as long as they stay subscribed. But as a special New Year offer, you can get an additional 30% off your first issue if you use the code at checkout.